So as you know, you've joined this webinar on inclusive leadership and being a champion for equality. This is something that I'm really passionate about, but first I'll kind of jump into what the outcomes for this webinar are going to be. This is, I believe, about an hour and a half, but I will be leaving quite a few minutes for questions and discussion throughout as well as at the end. So the main outcomes for the webinar are understanding what unconscious bias is and how to check your own biases, because we've all got our own biases and they impact everything that we do. And number two is about briefly understanding the types of marginalisation that exist in the world and starting your own journey of empathy to understanding your marginalisation as well as your privilege, and then how to take action to be a champion for equality. And I can see that a lot of the attendees have said that your passion is around diversity and inclusion and empowerment. So I hope that we can then talk about some practical actions to be more inclusive as an individual, but also as a leader within JCI and within your workplace and other areas of your life. And then I would love to jump into towards the end if there are any best practices that all of the attendees want to share. I know there's a lot of diversity of various countries that you've come from, so it'd be great to share any learnings or best practices that you have. So before we jump into it, I just want to say this webinar is not a certification or an apology or a get out of jail free card. So if you're not living your best life as a champion for equality, don't just say you went to this webinar by Nurain and that's why that you're fine not to be told off or anything like that. I'm also not giving out any legal advice, and I think the law is very different in different countries, and I'm over here in New Zealand, so it might be different. But I have taken some pieces up from the Human Rights Declaration as well around discrimination, so we'll be talking about that a little bit. What I also haven't made this webinar to be a place where we ask questions about whether discrimination is bad, and we don't really want to discuss here because we don't have time, so you can have a chat to me afterwards. But this webinar is not the time to be discussing whether discrimination is bad or whether it exists. So I hope that's okay with everyone. If that's all right, we will keep kicking on. So this slide is mainly just to show you that I do know what I'm talking about. I've been doing diversity and inclusion training, cultural competency training, unconscious bias training, and speaking on the topic of diversity and inclusion in New Zealand and across a few different JCI organisations for a number of years now. I also spoke at the 61st United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. My passion, which I've asked everyone to share, my passion really is about creating a more equitable world where everyone has equal opportunities and everyone feels like they can participate and really be their authentic selves. Outside of my kind of JCI work as well as my NGO work, my 9-to-5 day job, I work as a senior consultant in finance at Ernst & Young here in New Zealand. So yeah, that is me. If you have any questions as we go along, please put it in the chat box and then I will address it either at the time or at the end. So I would really like this to be quite a safe space, and I know that everyone's signed up to this webinar because everyone's really curious to know what they can do and how to be a leader in championing equality. So we're just being really respectful about everyone's mission and values. Everyone's got different perspectives, so just be respectful of the different journeys. You can drop out. This is kind of for my in-person webinars, but if you want to drop out and then come back in, that's fine as well. This workshop, I should say, is actually recorded now. So if you have any issues with that, please let me know as well. So if you do repeat, if you're sharing any stories now throughout the chat box or throughout the workshop, please do anonymize it if you're giving scenarios or anything like that. And if you want to share any stories or ask any questions about specific scenarios, please just share at a really respectful level of people that you've met at a conference. I should say my voice is kind of cutting out because it's really early in the morning here in New Zealand, so I hope that's all right for everyone. I've just put this little GIF here because it can be a little bit awkward talking about your own unconscious biases and actually looking at yourself and wondering whether you're doing the right thing. And I just want to say that this webinar is meant to be just you starting off on your journey, and we're all in it together and learning and doing, practicing the leadership that we want to practice and being more inclusive. So that's just to kind of let you know that we're all sitting here in our pool of awkwardness together. So the first part of the webinar, the way that I've structured it is to have a little bit of theory on understanding unconscious bias. If you have any questions at all, if you want me to clarify any terminology or anything in this portion, please do let me know. There's a lot in here that I've put that you can revisit or research by yourself or give me a message about. But this is just a really basic overview of what unconscious bias is and how it plays out. So what is bias? Before we go on to that one, if you know what bias is, or if you've seen a definition of it, or if you have any ideas of what bias is, would you like to put it in the chat box now? Prejudice, that's great. That's exactly right. I think unconscious bias is something that is such a hot topic these days, but also there's a lot of confusion about what it is or what we can do towards it. So either that's a great definition, leaning towards an idea without being aware that it's not fairly based. Anyone else want to jump in there? And then I will actually talk through some of the theory. Mo, judging people because of generalizations made about them, culture, religion, gender, that's perfect. There's a lot of assumption within unconscious bias, and we'll also talk about why that is as well. Thank you. So what is bias? So I really like this definition, which is the SEEDS model by David Rock at the New Leadership Institute. And I think this covers a lot of why we have unconscious bias and why it's actually quite natural for your brain to be making all these assumptions and judgments. So the first one there in SEEDS, the acronym is similarity. And that's kind of a safety. I'm sure that you can all understand that's a safe way of doing it. If you think about yourself walking into a networking event where you don't know anyone, you might gravitate towards people that is in your same age group or you feel like is in your same group. And that's because you think that people like me are better than others, and it feels safer and more comfortable. Expedience, it's more that it's a lot harder to stop your assumption in the first place and say, oh, actually, that assumption might not be right, and challenge yourself. It takes a lot more time and it takes practice to do that. So it's a lot quicker to say, oh, my instinct is right and it must be true. Your experience. So if you've had, one or two experiences with certain groups of people and you don't feel safe around them, or, some experiences, you can say, oh, I've had one or two experiences, and so I can apply that across the board to a whole population. distance, where if you don't have people with different marginalizations or with different experiences within your friend group, you tend to feel that the people closer to you are the people that you understand, and so you have less understanding as you have more distance. So I think JCI is a great example of being able to break those barriers down, because we meet people from so many different cultures and backgrounds. And safety. So I think safety is a really interesting one for me, particularly because, you know, the bad experiences that you have with the particular, particular types of people, or people from different backgrounds, or even, different areas, if you've got a bad experience, it really kind of burrows itself in your mind, and that holds true. But if you've got a good experience, that doesn't impact as much. And that's really your brain talking about how safe it is as well. So this is just a really easy model to think about what's going on. So if you were to walk into a room after this workshop and you were thinking about your own bias, you could start thinking about what is the thing that you're doing if you're making any assumptions. Okay. So what is bias? This is not necessarily a definition of bias in itself, but the way that I like to talk about bias is through privilege and oppression, or marginalisation. I'll probably be interchanging between oppression and marginalisation throughout this workshop. So privilege is really an unearned advantage that is given by society to some people, but not all. So that's the reason why it is called privilege. So here in New Zealand, we talk about the kind of white European population having more privilege, and you can see that through the statistics as well. And that's because there exists some marginalisation and oppression where it is systemic, pervasive inequality that is present throughout society, and it benefits people with more privilege and actually harms people with fewer privileges. So when I've had questions in previous workshops about this, I think the key to understanding privilege versus oppression is not to say that you're trying to take something away from the privileged person. It's really to say that because privilege exists, it actually actively harms those who are marginalized, or those who don't have the privilege. So it's a really important thing to say. It's not just a privilege that exists in a vacuum. It does harm the people who have fewer privileges, and we'll talk a little bit about the statistics around that as well. So before we jump into that, I also want to kind of introduce you to some more terminology, which is called the target, which is someone who suffers from oppression, or also called a member of a marginalized group, and an ally. So an ally is a member of a social group that enjoys some privilege, but they're working to end oppression and also understand their own privilege. So there's two actions here if you're going to be an ally, and I hope that at the end of this workshop, you're all working to be an ally in your own workplaces or in your own leadership. So it's really doing the work to understand your own privilege, and working to end it. So even if you're just speaking up, at work meetings where you feel like someone is being interrupted, or even something small like making sure that if you're in the office, just observing who is doing the office housework, and just making sure that those people are not the marginalized people, for example. And we'll jump into some more detailed examples in a minute. So this is just to say that allyship isn't just about, sitting back and doing the reading. I know that there seems to be quite a lot of situations nowadays where you feel like it's not equal, there's lots of bias or discrimination, and you feel like you can't do everything. Like I mentioned, the main key here is to say, if there is a situation where you feel like you have privilege, and you yourself are safe, but someone else is being discriminated against or marginalized, being an ally means that you are proactive, so speaking up, or making sure that you're just standing beside the person who's being marginalized. Does anyone have any questions at this stage, or anything that's unclear before we go on to the next part? We all happy? Okay. So jumping into what is unconscious bias. So if we think about unconscious bias in terms of conscious bias and unconscious bias, conscious is when we know that we are prejudiced and we observe and others observe it in our behavior. So, for example, I might be prejudiced against people who ride bikes, for example. I'm not, by the way, but in New Zealand, that seems to be this really interesting case where there's always opposition between car drivers and bike riders. So if people know that I am prejudiced against bike riders, and if I'm driving and I'm always honking the horn and just really explicitly saying, bike riders are the worst people ever, as an example, that is something that I know that I'm biased against. I know that I don't like bike riders, and others can see that in my behavior. Unconscious bias is really difficult to address, and that's why we have trainings like this, is because we are not actually aware of our own bias, and we believe that we're actually acting objectively and fairly. And that's like a couple of you have said here, those are assumptions about groups or individuals with characteristics that are not based on observable or provable data. So if you were making assumptions about groups of people, like Mo said, their culture, religion, gender, ability, whatever it is, those are assumptions that if you went and actually looked at the research or the facts, that cannot be proved. So I think the key with unconscious bias and actually addressing it, because we all have biases, like I said, with the SEEDS model, that's just how our brains work, is really about looking at making your unconscious bias conscious and then acting in a way that where you're addressing it to be more inclusive and actually to challenge your own bias and see what the facts are. So the reason why unconscious bias, I've left a little fact down there. The reason why unconscious bias is so, I guess, insidious and harmful is because it actually impacts people's lives. And if we go back to the definition I talked about earlier around privilege and marginalisation, this can actually have real life effects on the people who are marginalised. So I found the study just while I was prepping for this workshop around white job applicants that was done in 2009 in the UK, where white job applicants were 74% more likely than applicants from ethnic minorities to have success with identical CVs. So in the study, what they went and did was they had the exact same CV that they cold send out to public and private institutions, and just asking for a chat or even like a introductory interview. And overall, the white job applicants were 74% more likely to have a response than applicants from ethnic minorities. So it is, I guess the point here is that it is very real, the effect of unconscious bias across institutions, workplaces, and organizations. So going on to what we are going to talk about in this webinar a little bit more, and the types of marginalisation. I won't be able to cover all of this, but it's really important to think about different types of marginalisation and discrimination and understand that actually it's not one thing, it's the intersectionality of different things. And when you actually think about your privilege as well, for example, if I talk about myself, I am marginalized in some ways in different contexts, but I am also very privileged. So, for example, I have postgraduate education, I am straight, I am middle class, I have English as one of my first languages, and, I am cisgender. I am also relatively young at the moment. So all these things are different things that can interact in an intersectional way across your life as you live. And it was also very based on the context. So in New Zealand, those things are privileges, and maybe in other cultures, your young age might not be a privilege, for example. So that's just a kind of a list of things for you to think about. This is by no means exhaustive, And I'm sure there's different things that will come up. But if you have any questions or want to know a bit more about a particular type of marginalisation or want to share about how that plays out in your country, please do share. I also wanted to touch a little bit on the way that bias plays out alongside those different types of marginalisation. So the types of unconscious bias that are commonly found is beauty bias. And I think in this age of kind of Facebook and Instagram and social media, people, judge people based on how they look. Often there's also a gender component to this. There's lots of research that I've seen around the height of men, for example, and taller men, or even just appearances in terms of voice. So I have a really high voice, and I'm often told that, by men that they can't take me seriously because I have a high voice, for example. So that's just kind of an appearance bias and beauty bias. Affinity biases, and I think we all can see this often in a culture like New Zealand, especially because New Zealand is so small and we probably have like 2 to 3 degrees of separation between our networks. A lot of the time hiring decisions are made with connections, and I'm not sure whether that's the case within your own organizations as well. Share that in the chat box if you feel like it is or it is not. I'd love to know. But people do hire people who are very similar to you, and that's kind of affinity bias and looking at addressing that through unconscious bias. So the question was whether you feel like in your country you feel like in hiring decisions there's affinity bias. So do people hire through their networks or people they know? That's really interesting. Yeah. So I know in New Zealand there's a really big push about, actually trying to expand that. And because where I live in Auckland, there's a really different population growth now. We have a lot of migrants and also a lot of first and second generation migrants. And so there's definitely a shift coming, but it doesn't feel like the kind of hiring decisions are actually keeping up with the change in time. Thank you, Jen and Suava. Suava, it looks like you said, depends on who you know or even who your family or father is. That's really interesting. I think it is still the same in different places, and you can see that in the leadership around a lot of the corporates as well globally. Please do keep sharing your stories because I think it's really important, especially when we've got a platform like this where we can get to tap into and share stories across different countries. That's a really interesting point that you've just raised, Ricky. It's just that, you're hiring the best person for the job, but it's more likely that you get the job that if you know someone. I think what's really interesting about that is that if you go back to our initial definition of unconscious bias, is that the people who are hiring probably think that they're not being biased at all. They think they're being really fair and, objective and everything like that. So, when you have situations like that, I find in organizations, and we'll talk a little bit about what you can do in organizations, but I find in organizations you really have to have a real conscious push to do it together and have policies in place. And thank you, Diane, about the Netherlands as well, affinity bias. It's really interesting. I'll keep tracking on. So the Horse effect, which is really interesting. And we've got a little interesting diagram here, but it's about negative assumptions clouding our judgment. And I think, everyone is guilty of this if you've had a really bad interaction. And I think if we go back to the seeds diagram that we talked about bias and the definition around that, the negative assumptions because we're trying to be safe, right? There's a lot of anti-migrant sentiment around the world if you read the news as well. And sometimes I'm like, oh, but why do people think that way? I often think that that's because they want to keep their safety. A lot of the older people tend to understand the world in a particular way, and they don't want to have to change that. And they have all these negative assumptions that are not based in fact, that cloud their judgment, and that impacts on their unconscious bias. So the next view here, I think you will all be familiar with, confirmation bias. And I think confirmation bias you will probably be familiar with in that you will probably do this for your own self. So if you think something about yourself as well, you'll be searching for evidence to back up these impressions. So say someone saw, saw me and they heard my voice and they thought that I was, just a really gentle, soft, not very opinionated girl, say, for example, and then they'll keep looking for evidence or other situations to back it up. Attribution bias is how we perceive the actions of others, and then you'll attribute it to, the whole group, for example. Conformity bias is where people tend to conform to changing their opinions to conform with the majority group. And then the halo effect is if you have someone who is closer, a close friend to you, the people who are closer to you or your loved ones that you don't see their kind of, negative traits. So you might see the positive traits as having more positive traits than others. So if you have any questions about any of these, let me know now. Otherwise, I can keep going because we're going to leave unconscious bias behind and then start talking about equity. So, however, that's a great point on confirmation bias and showing the same posts. Well, we will be talking a little bit more about later on challenging your assumptions and actually looking at how you can break out of that. It is very difficult in this age of social media because social media has algorithms to keep you in your own bubble. Cool. So this is around, can you act as a champion for equality? Because it's really, when you're thinking about doing this on an organizational level in particular, I think it is really important to look at whether you have the power to do this, and power in terms, not necessarily in terms of status, but because it can be really difficult if you're in a really traditional organization that has the attitude that, that you've talked about already in some of the comments where, people think they're hiring the best person for the job, or people think that, they've hired someone that, that they think is right for the job, and that's just how it's always been done. If you want to be a champion for equality, you either need to be someone who has some sort of privilege and therefore to be listened to, unfortunately, or if you're not someone with privilege but you're really passionate about equality like I am, and often in the New Zealand context, because I'm a migrant, I'm a practicing Muslim, and I'm a woman and I'm very young, I tend to not have privilege in those circumstances in large organizations to influence. So what you can do is to find someone who has the privilege and who is willing to act as an ally, or you can kind of try and educate them and get them on board on your side. But the point here isn't that you can't, if you have marginalisation, you can't act that way. You definitely can. The point here is to say that all of the research shows that if you have privilege, it's a lot easier for you to get influence in an organisation so that things change. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So has anyone seen this little picture before around the difference between equality and equity? Great. Lots of people have seen it. Would anyone like to have a go at why this picture is, what it is trying to tell us? No? Okay. Um, so I think this picture is really powerful because it really talks to that unknown privilege. Different but equal, yeah. Jen, that's a great answer. That giving everyone what they need and is not the same. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting concept to think about if we go back to what we were talking about before about privilege and how privilege gives an unearned advantage to everyone and how marginalisation actually harms people. It's to say that equity means that you're all on a level playing field and that you actually have, in this scenario, they've all been given the same thing. But that doesn't mean that you have an equal playing field, even though they've been given the same thing. And that's really looking at, the historical context as well. And when we do some of the question and answer sessions in a few minutes or scenarios, we'll find a little bit more about what that means. Is that looking at the historical context and, for example, the little guy in this picture here, he's a lot younger. And so that means that he needs a bit more help to get there. And that's just contextualizing what is needed. And we'll continue. If you have any questions about the difference between equality and equity, please do let me know. But when we're being champions for equality, I've said equality because it's a little bit more better understandable than equity, but we talk a lot more about equity because that's what we're trying to get to here. So if in case anyone on the webinar was asking the question, why do we need equity? One of the things that the UN has said is that empowering women and girls is key to achieving the 17 of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That is half the population of the world, and they are being marginalised in so many different ways. For example, the McKinsey Global Study 2015 says that if women and men played an identical role in labour markets, $28 trillion would be added to the global economy by 2025. It's quite a lot of lost labour that we're having here. And if you think about all of those things that are really positive that we would achieve with gender equality as just one example, and we haven't actually even talked about the intersectionalities of race and, how that interacts, that is a really big rate of, at the current rate of female empowerment around the world, it would take 220 years to close the gender gap. Who thinks that's too long? How many generations is that? Yeah, definitely. Yep, that's right. Unfortunately, as we go, I shouldn't laugh. I'm just kind of laughing painfully. But as we go along in all the different statistics that we're seeing, it is actually getting longer and increasing the number of years across the world, and that is really sad and unfortunate. So why do we need champions for equality? I think this is a really, really important quote that I've I've kind of referred to earlier, that actually ethnic minorities or women leaders who engage in diversity, value, and behaviour, they're penalised with worse performance ratings. If they say, gender equality is important, or if they try to champion gender equality in their organisations or in general, they're actually penalised. Whereas if you have a leader from an ethnic majority or a male leader who engages in diversity valuing behavior, they're not penalized for doing so. So valuing diversity for minorities and women tend to actually result in worse performance ratings, whereas on the other side, for men and ethnic majority leaders, it's actually positive. I find this really interesting when thinking about it, because I think that this quote and the study is the best example where we really show the need for champions. So all of us here on the webinar, I feel like, are really privileged. And yeah, Jen, I found that really sad and really interesting as well. I feel like from a New Zealand context and probably across Europe, although it may be different, this really does apply in terms of the privilege that we hold, so we can really demonstrate this. I've left the little, if you want to have a look at this later, I've left the link to that study below. So there are some further interesting facts that I haven't kind of quoted here. But if you're interested in learning more, it is there. So the next thing I talk about, and this is really exciting, I think, because I think this is, in the world, this is a really interesting time to be talking about intolerance and tolerance. This is actually by the philosopher Karl Popper, and I understand that this philosophy came out because he used the analogy of Nazi Germany, and he was asking the question about whether a tolerant society, and this is a little bit kind of tricky to understand, whether should a tolerant society tolerate intolerance? So if we're to be a tolerant society, a tolerant organization, should we tolerate intolerance? So I think, does everyone kind of have scenarios or examples that you can think of where this has happened in your own cities or in your own communities, where people are having really, radical ideas and you say you want more tolerance and respect my ideas? Jen, we have it in JCI, yeah. JCI is a little microcosm of all of our communities, so definitely we will have it. Anyone else want to share? Just while we're tapping up your kind of examples, I'll share a little bit about what's been happening here in New Zealand recently. There is this couple who are religious, and it's not really about the religion that's the issue. So they're I guess they're a pastor and his wife that are running for Parliament, and because it's an election year in New Zealand, and their ideas are basically homophobic and xenophobic. There is no going around that. And there's an interesting situation where, does everyone know Dancing with the Stars? It's a celebrity show where we have celebrities and politicians go on a dancing show in New Zealand. And there was a big kind of controversy the last few days in the news and everything, that they were going to have the pastor's wife going to be on the show, and she is going to be talking about her ideas for the elections, just being really homophobic and really xenophobic and anti-migrant as well. And the media company that runs the show said they're not going to have her on there because of all the people kind of protesting and speaking up and saying that that's not okay. And now we've got all these commentators who are saying that it is free speech. So it's just, I feel like that kind of scenario is happening everywhere. Jen, you've shared that you've got a strong right-wing party in Germany. So issues with the county election related to that party and a JCI member. That's really interesting. Yeah. I think political views and tolerance is really interesting at the moment. So keep sharing, and I'll share with you what the paradox of tolerance says. So Karl Popper is saying that a tolerant society does not tolerate intolerance. That's a great point, Mohammed. Cool. Yep. Yeah, Swava, that's exactly a lot of what has happened in New Zealand and what keeps happening as well, because as you know, there's all sorts of stuff that comes out of the woodwork in an election year. So it is really interesting. Um, so if I keep talking about this paradox of tolerance, and there's a reason why this is a paradox, is because when we extend tolerance to those who are openly intolerant, the tolerant ones end up being destroyed and tolerance is destroyed with them. I hope that makes sense. So, if you say let's give them a chance, for example, what the members that you're talking about, Mohammed, where if you're recruiting members and they hold views, I don't think, personally, I don't think that it's an issue to hold any type of views. I'm happy to have conversations with, or even have members who are from right wing or left wing or whatever. The issue really isn't about their views. The issue for me is where people are actually actively intolerant and they advocate those views or they say those views out loud. And they, for example, with gender equality, they say something like women are not supposed to be leaders, and things like that, where you're actively being intolerant, and that's where you destroy the tolerant society. So Karl Popper says any movement that preaches intolerance and persecution must be outside of the law. And as paradoxical as it may seem, defending tolerance requires us not to tolerate the intolerant. Michael, interestingly enough, oh wow, that is interesting. We live in very interesting times. So, and I think all of those stories, thank you so much for sharing, because I think we learn a lot when you do share the different stories and different experiences. I think all of those stories really goes to show how much our leadership is really needed. For me, I'll share another little anecdote is that how many of you have heard of the Christchurch attacks in New Zealand? Probably a few of you. So if you haven't heard of it, back in March 2019, we had a shooter. So they went in and basically shot up two mosques in Christchurch. And, I am a practicing Muslim, so it's been really difficult for me to be able to keep talking in the spaces that I talk about diversity and inclusion, because it's really made all of the spaces feel very unsafe for me and my community. And I've only just really started speaking about it since October last year as well. And I suppose it's really this kind of, I personally feel like we're in this space or in this time where the leadership is really needed and all of your voices are really needed, and voices who are talking about, actually lifting up and saying, we're not going to tolerate intolerance is really needed. And I'd love to hear if you feel like you're able to share that, or if you feel like you're able to be leaders and creating those conversations as well. I know we're tracking on time, so I'm going to keep talking. Diane, that's really interesting. I find that happens quite often, and people don't. It might be different or similar in the Netherlands as well, but people don't take very well to being called out as a racist. So we'll talk about some strategies around that as well, because that if they have such unconscious bias where they have a particular idea of themselves, and they can't be challenged on that, there are some strategies to deal with that as well. Thank you, Freya. That's is also really interesting. A lot of comedy. Yeah. Yeah, it definitely is. There's also a lot of comedy, I think, not comedy as in jokes, but comedians who talk about these important issues. And I think comedy does play an important role in trying to raise those conversations, but in workplaces as well, definitely. I feel like we're kind of moving a bit ahead of ourselves with some of the scenarios and like strategies that I've had. So I'll keep tracking on. I do also have to be at work in an hour or so, so I'll keep going. If you want to share anything with me afterwards, let me know. And this is a great point here. So if you're trying to be a champion for equality or equity, 101 is to be short, simple, and firm. Don't try to be funny. I have heard people trying to be funny before while trying to be a champion for equality. It often goes wrong, trust me. Practice simple responses. So, for example, if you are in a privileged situation where you can speak up for someone. So, Diane, if I was with you, I'm not sure how they would feel about me. I may not be Asian, but I am a woman of color, so I'm not sure whether they would take it from me. But if I was there, it's just about kind of, being able to, make a simple response to say, hey, actually, that was discriminatory. And also picking your battles. I think that one is really important for people who do have a lot of marginalization and who do get a lot of racism and intolerance. Because, like I battle it every day almost, and I kind of put myself in those situations because I actively talk about it. But, save your energy if you don't feel like you can, or you're wanting to preserve your own mental health as well. Okay. So I've got a couple of scenarios here, and the main point of these scenarios it's not really to kind of practice group work right now. It's mainly just to kind of give you an idea of the scenarios that you might come across. And I'm sure some of these scenarios I've actually picked up from, actual stories that people have told me over the years. And then I've added in some structure to what you could do if you were a champion for equality from an individual perspective and also an organizational perspective. So I will be pausing. I think we've got about half an hour. So I'll be pausing across the group scenarios a little bit just to find out a bit more about what you think and what you might do in those situations. We're not going to be able to do too much group work here today, so we'll skip over that. But this one is a really interesting one just to keep in mind, so I'll touch on it briefly. This is from an organizational point of view, even a JCI or a work perspective. If you're doing a group discussion, you might try and, do this where you choose a gatekeeper to interrupt people who are speaking too much. And I wonder if you have work meetings where, women get interrupted too much or women's ideas get adopted by other people, or even, people from ethnic minorities get, that kind of interruption. So a great way to stop that, and I have tried this, is to say at the very start of the meeting, I'm chairing the meeting, but I've chosen Jen, for example, to be the gatekeeper. And what Jen is going to do is, if someone is speaking too much, they're going to interrupt the person who's speaking too much and ask the people who are not speaking as much if they want to speak. And if someone is interrupting other people, they're going to stop you. And then I'm also going to give everyone permission to gatekeep the gatekeeper. And so if you want to test this out on a JCI workshop where you know that you've got friends, it's quite an interesting thing happens where usually you have group discussions and it doesn't actually play out the way that you want to, or someone's dominating. This is a great way to kind of level the playing field and actually give people the opportunity to speak up. So that's just a tool in your toolkit. We can't practice that today, unfortunately, but I'll keep tracking on. So there's a couple more things there just around rules lawyering. So, and I think this is an interesting one to play around with when you have scenarios where, people, you've said, look, something that you've just said is racist. And they say, oh, but, it can't be racist in this context, or, something really specific. just say, that's not really the context and you're not bringing in the context. These scenarios, and in general, I tend to say, because a lot of the work that I do is in two buckets. So Authenticity Aotearoa, which is the social enterprise that I founded, a lot of that work is with marginalised young women and talking about their safety and how to practice leadership in a safe manner. And then the other work that I do is work like this, where I talk about unconscious bias and how to challenge that for leaders and for organizations. So I want to say, when we're talking about these scenarios, if you are someone with marginalization or a minority background, often you may not be able to respond as a champion for equality because you're the one that's being, that has the power taken away in those scenarios. It might not actually be safe for you to speak up. So if you have any questions around that distinction, just type it in the chat box and I'll address it as we go. But this is specifically for scenarios where you are a leader, and you might be a leader within JCI, I'm sure you all are, and you can actually speak up. And if you see someone else as being a target, that's where you can actually speak up as well. So for the first scenario, and Swava will have seen this, I found this one really interesting because this is a real scenario. A vice president in the reporting chain, say you're in your company and in your reporting chain, he is really proud of being a champion for diversity. At the same time, when he's in meetings, he talks over people of colour or ethnic minorities. He refuses to assign the best projects to a new mother when she returns from maternity leave. And he also goes around complimenting women who report to him on their physical attractiveness. So if you were thinking about this situation and you felt like you were, you had some power in the situation and you felt like you wanted to act as a champion for equity, what might you do? What are some things that you could address? Yep, that's a great point, Jen. But also equally, it might be that you're maybe not in his direct line of reporting. And so there's ways to think about it where you might have a lot more power than you think you have. So, for example, if it's coming from outside the reporting line, what do others think? So we're talking about not within the reporting line in this situation. Slava, that's a great idea. Report to HR, that's a great thing to do. And I think often in big, larger companies nowadays, HR is very aware of it. Assigning a gatekeeper is a really great little thing to do in meetings. And that's something that you might want to talk to this person if they're in your organization and just say, hey, I think the meeting would run really well if we assigned a gatekeeper. And that doesn't, it's kind of thinking from the perspective of that person and also the perspective of the people who are being marginalized and what would be best for them. It might feel, sometimes I feel like it might feel really good to just, call someone out as a racist, but that doesn't achieve the end goal, which is I want the situation to be better for other people of color, for example. Yeah, that's true, Jen. Yep, absolutely, Swala. Cool. Okay. Addressing is probably the best. That's right. Yep. And we have some scenarios to kind of, or some tools and tips to actually address this with him directly. One of the biggest things that we talk about is reframing. So reframing, because it's really easy when you're the marginalized person to feel like it's kind of a one-on-one situation. But if you think about this situation, the reason why it is important that he doesn't talk over people of color in meetings is because people of color are often marginalized. Mothers are often penalized. In New Zealand, I'm not sure if anyone has the other statistics for mothers, but in New Zealand, I believe the gender parity, so gender pay gap, is about 12%. If you are a mother, that jumps to 15%. So it's definitely something that impacts their kind of very real life thing. So it's really about reframing it. Diane requests him to stop talking over people of color and focus on the real important subjects. Yep. And then report to HR. Yeah, definitely. Reframing. So often people kind of, frame discussions or questions. So say in this situation, if you were to go and talk to him, you might say, oh, no, I didn't mean to, or this person, I was just talking over this person because they don't know something, or, I just don't think that the new mother can handle it. So it's stuff like that where if you have responses like that, you can kind of bring in the overall context to say, this is important because it impacts on the pay gap. If you're not giving her more projects, that means that she is, not being given the same opportunities as the others. Learn to recognize when that is happening and refuse to accept it. So that's really about looking at the kind of context of systemic oppression. And if people are saying, oh no, she's just a woman, like she's just a girl, and this is the only situation in which I'm discriminating against women, or, I just want to say that she's beautiful. That's where you say, no, actually, that's wrong, because we have systemic sexism across the world, and we don't want to accept it. Does that make sense in terms of reframing what you're doing, so that you are kind of contextualizing it to, here's the wider context, here is the material impact of it? Yes. It's very hard when I can't hear people. Thanks, Jen. This one I find really interesting. There's also further reading here, which is the Wikipedia page on ambivalent sexism. But that piece where, the vice president was saying that, that we think that women should be complimented and that's a nice thing to do, is actually harmful, because that comes from the belief that women are weaker or subservient. If you find, I've got friends who so often complain about being the person who has to pour the drinks at work, or, do all the office housework, as it were. And that's just really this kind of reinforcing belief about that. There's also the other belief that women are ethically better or more socially skilled, and so men are, can be excused for being rude or wrong, or doing wrong things. And that is actually harmful as well, because, if we look at sexism and if we look at the different ways that, inequality manifests, it is actually harmful for men as well. And people probably know about toxic masculinity, but there's lots more that we could talk about on this, but I will keep moving on. How do you support colleagues? So if you think about the people of color, we've kind of said we'll report it to HR. If you think about the people of color that we were talking about in that first situation, I'm just wondering, what would be the impact on the people of color if you went to HR and said, hey, this guy is talking over people of color? It's just something to think about, because if you're in if you're not in the same situation as the person of color, if you're not a person of color, for example, it's very difficult to know what their experience is. And maybe they've gone and talked to HR. And Jen raised a great point earlier about, the programs, speaking up programs are often marginalized in companies. And so if you go and do that immediately without understanding what is better for the colleague, then it can be harmful. So this is just to say, think about kind of the inadvertent harm, and you might feel like you're doing the right thing, but also make sure that what you are doing is the right thing for your colleague and it comes from the wider context. And also an understanding that you don't know what their experience is, and you might not know what the right thing to do in that scenario for them is. And another interesting part of that is that, for example, you go and tell HR and then you come and tell the person of color, oh, that was really hard when they interrupted you. And I just, can you explain how that is like to me? And can you just tell me that I'm a good ally because I've gone and told HR now? So make sure that in your kind of journey to being a leader in this space and championing equity, that you're not kind of asking others to do emotional labor for you. Has anyone seen ring theory? Okay. I might quickly, if there's a whiteboard. No. Okay. So there is a link there to talk about, but can you see the whiteboard here? Cool. Okay. So this is you. Excuse my handwriting. So if this is you, and you're the one that's being impacted by something, say, and this is your closest friends in this circle. So this is you within this circle. These are your closest friends and family in this one circle. And then there's like all your colleagues and acquaintances on the other circle. And then there's your whole community around. I'm sorry, I can't draw circles on this computer, so just pretend they're circles. So this is kind of yourself in the center as someone who is experiencing something. For example, you've experienced marginalization, say, and then this is your closest friends. The next level of the circle is kind of colleagues, acquaintances, and then the wider community here. So if you've experienced something, you're allowed to dump to your closest friends. So say I've often experienced a lot of racism at corporate events, for example, where people kind of come up to me and say, why the heck are you talking about racism and discrimination? And I often come home and I'm exhausted. So I tend to share with my partner or my family, my sister, my mom. And so, my experience, I share it with them. And then, for example, my partner doesn't go, oh, it's so hard for me that you're experiencing racism. So this goes out this way if you've experienced racism. Whereas the people in this circle, if you're the one that has had this experience and you're the one that's having to deal with the emotional impact of it, the people in this circle, they don't dump on you, right? So if you think about it in a ring theory and a sick person, for example, if someone is sick, and your family's having to take care of you, your family doesn't come to you and say, oh, it's so difficult to take care of you. They will go and then share with their closest friends and the people in the outside circle. But this does, and then, on and on, where if you have something that is being impacted by an inner circle, you don't kind of dump on the inside circle, or you don't get comfort from the inside circle, because the people in the inner circle are the ones who are actually being impacted. Does that make sense? And because they're the ones who are actually dealing with the situation and are closer. So that's what ring theory says. And it's a really interesting theory that I can't go too much into detail on because we've only got about 25 minutes. But does that kind of make sense? I apologize for my circles. Cool, perfect. If you do have any questions, type it in and we'll try and see if we have any time at the end. But just do keep that ring theory in mind around, if someone's experienced racism. I really it's something that I really struggle with because, and I think I tend to experience it a lot more because I put myself out there talking about these really difficult topics. And I find it really difficult when the people that I share it with, or my friends, for example, try and say, oh, it's so difficult that you're always talking about this, or it's so difficult that you're so angry about this. So it's really just, something to keep in mind to safeguard the people that you're actually trying to show your allyship to. Thank you, Jen. Another one that I find really interesting, where people tend to want to be validated. So I will address this question now because that's really interesting. Svava, you've got a question about you being a part of an LGBTQI community. People often form friendships and support circles with other marginalized groups. Yeah, I think there's kind of, I guess the power differential I'm trying to create here is where, someone who is experiencing it and someone who's not experienced it. So if you are in a support group, so very similar to Authenticity, Aotearoa, where we're in a support group and we're just sharing experiences back and forth between each other, that is absolutely fine and really important work because I think, validating each other's experiences and understanding that you're not alone is very important. I guess the difference in the situation that I'm talking about is where if you're being an ally and if you're a kind of a leader and you're not experiencing it together, then that's the scenario in which I'm talking about, where you're requesting emotional labor from a person who is experiencing that. I hope that makes sense. And again, just to reiterate, often, I did a 3-hour workshop on a similar, on this topic at World Congress, and often I do like a, 4 to 5 hour workshop or a full day workshop on this. So this is very much a really condensed version, and I'm just introducing some ideas that you might be able to take away. So if you do have questions or if you want to have a chat to me afterwards, let me know. And this is kind of on the same topic, how to support colleagues and really be sincere and other focused. So other focused is be focused on them. So if you've experienced a situation where they've been interrupted, really try to focus it on them. Try not to be angry and say, oh, I hate it when other people interrupt other people. Try to say, oh, I'm sorry, that would have been really tough for you. How can I help? I'm really thinking of you. Offer help in an unobtrusive way. So don't try to think that you know the best, and try and keep on topic. And another way that you can help, particularly in election years, I think, is to donate money to causes that can help, because I think we've all got different situations. So that's a really kind of, if you have no idea how actively to help, that might be a good way to do it. I'm really conscious that we're running out of time very quickly, so I will keep tracking on. The next scenario is an interesting one, and I think we've touched on the LGBTQI plus community as well. So this is one where we've said, given what we've learned, I'd really love to quickly have your answers here. If a co-worker comes out as a trans woman, another co-worker is talking to you and assumes that you are a cis person and starts complaining to you privately, saying, isn't it so inconsiderate to expect everyone to remember to use his new name and gender? Why can't people just be happy with what they're born with? So given all the things that we've talked about, what are some kind of good approaches that you think might work in this situation? That's a really, really great one. Yep. And I think, Jen, you've raised a good point that, the facts and figures that we've talked about, they really hit home, because then you really challenge people's assumptions as well when you bring in the facts and figures and suicide rates, and really, tying that into the reframing where you're saying, here's the wider context of why you should be being a bit more inclusive and being a bit more accepting. That's great. Any others? Yep, Sava, that's a great one to do. Yep. I think what I really like about Witch Swava's kind of, imagine if you woke up in a different body or a different gender, is really that, you're really able to, pull someone in to say, hey, what if you were in their shoes? And can you kind of recontextualize that to say, this is very different. Mohammed, that's really a great point as well. The different contexts are really important as well. And, it's really more about, for me, it's that if I'm not in that particular scenario and if I'm not the one experiencing it, but you are a leader, it's really about saying what kind of, what kind of inclusive communities are you creating? And, it doesn't matter what people's different beliefs are. If you're going into, I don't know, say a JCI event where the context is different, how do you bring your inclusive leadership and really kind of challenge what you're used to as well? But that's a great point that different communities are very different. Yeah, Jen, always trying to find a relatable situation to the speaker. Yeah, they're definitely. Imagine if everyone looked at you. That's right. I'm really interested in kind of the responses to this one because I think, people can tend to, react very differently because the situation's unfamiliar. And it's just so easy, in this situation, it's just so easy to just laugh away and walk away from it. Yeah, so that you shared with me how this happened to you at work. Diane, I'm sorry that's happened to you. You don't have a choice when you were born. Yeah, definitely. That's a great point. I think, yeah, definitely. One of the biggest things about creating an organization with respect and an organization where you actually have, people who are being more inclusive is really about, being able to say, hey, this is an organization where we have policies that value equity. We have policies where we are being inclusive, and this is the kind of values that we exhibit. So that's a really great point as well. I'll wait a couple more minutes and then we'll jump on to the next bit. Cool. Thank you so much all for sharing. I know it's a difficult topic and different contexts are very different, and it is, in New Zealand, this is, very common, and we tend to be at the forefront of actually, being really radically inclusive, I like to call it. And, it doesn't, for me, it goes back to what you say, where it doesn't matter what you personally believe. It's really about the respect that you have for other people and creating spaces where everyone can exist together. So I'll keep tracking on, but if you're typing something in, please do share. That would be really great. Remind them we're all different and have had different experiences and show empathy. That's perfect. Yep, that's great as well. This is some terminology just to share because I think, there's, lots of different people tuning in from different contexts, but this is just a terminology around gender. Yep. I can switch off the video if that's an issue that's coming through. Is it just crackling up or breaking up? Okay, cool. Freya, it might be something on your end, so maybe that. I'll keep jumping on through this because we have 15 minutes and then I have to get to work, so I don't have too much time on my end. I'm really sorry. So this is just some terminology for your reference. It is there just so that if you come across it, it might not be very open on your end, on your communities and in your context, but this is just for you to know and get comfortable with, because different people's contexts are very different as well. So cisgender, your gender is the same as that was assigned to you at birth, sorry. I'm still thinking about work. Trans is where your gender is different than the gender that was assigned to you at birth. And then non-binary is male or female, doesn't quite describe your gender accurately. And this is really kind of important to think about these terminologies in the context that a lot of the kind of different sexism issues that you talk about is socialized, but these things are talking about gender, where the gender that was assigned to you at birth. So just kind of making that context a bit clearer as well. I'll power through this rest of it. So some tips here, just using they instead of he for third person. And this is really great because, that can be a way of kind of taking power away when using men for trans, women for cis and trans women, and then non-binary people. So if you use kind of gender neutral language, it means that you are being really inclusive. So this is another tip here, going back to that scenario, is to say often when people discuss things in private, so where this coworker has said, hey, I think you're going to agree with me, this is your chance to change that opinion and point out that it is uncomfortable. I know it can be really uncomfortable in different contexts where, perhaps it is a societal norm that, there isn't gender equality or these topics are not talked about. But if someone has shared something with you, I think as leaders, it is really our responsibility to be a bit more inclusive. Cool. So I will power through this last scenario because it is kind of tracking on time a little bit. But this scenario was talking about a disabled colleague of yours that complains when the access ramp is blocked by bicyclists again. Another coworker says, why is he so angry? It's unprofessional. If people would be more reasonable, they would get what they ask for more often. I won't ask to share for this one because we're kind of just powering through the rest of this. But the main takeaway from all of these scenarios is that if you're speaking up, here are a few tips. So the tips that we talked about where we're educating yourself, being comfortable with discomfort, speaking for yourself and not others. Don't say, oh, don't do that in front of Joe. That's very offensive for, different people in that group. So, for example, if someone was being racist to me, or, someone was saying something that was related to my religion that says, oh, no, don't do that in front of Nurain. Don't talk about that. That's very offensive. And I'm sure that hurt her. That's not actually speaking up and actually making a change. Saying, I think that is wrong, is actually speaking up and being a leader in that situation. Cool. So this is a scenario that I've included previously, and I've shared with a couple of you that this is something that I often experience. So at a party at work, a coworker is not drinking due to religious reasons. Despite knowing this, other coworkers spend the event offering them alcoholic drinks and saying they're no fun. So some of the kind of tips and tricks around this is to say, if you're shaping an event around alcohol, there's so many myths about bad behavior. So if you're, like a couple of colleagues might have said to me, oh, they're just drinking and so that's why they're pressuring you. Yeah, so that's a really great point. And maybe this is something that we can use with JCI events and just say, hey, we can use some of these tips from this webinar. So hopefully you can. So the first bit that I'm going to cover off is that if someone is drunk or tipsy or whatever, they've had a large amount of alcohol, and unfortunately or fortunately, I do not have personal experience of this, but this is research, and I've linked that down below. According to research, the immediate physiological effects of alcohol are loss of coordination, sleepiness, difficulty multitasking. Those are the kinds of physical effects that alcohol has. Everything else that covers violence, sexual advances, rude comments, those are under conscious control, and people have to be accountable for those behaviors. So if you have a look at that link later on, but I think that's really important if you're acting as an ally. It's important to observe behavior where there is violence or rude comments or whatever it is, sexual advances, whatever it is. If you observe that, not to excuse that behavior as just, someone being drunk. And that's just taking responsibility and stepping up as an ally as well. And then I believe there's something that I haven't quite touched on, going back here, is that the other kind of good tip I can have about events and, the things that can go wrong around equality, around events, and something that Suave has mentioned where that happens at JCI events, is that if you look at an event and design it at the very front of mind where you're saying, I want this event to be inclusive. So I organized a client event just recently and said, we'll have way more non-alcoholic drinks than alcoholic drinks. And people tend to choose to go for the non-alcoholic drinks because there isn't that social pressure. Or you say when you're organizing an event at the very start, you say, hey, I'm organizing this event and there is accessibility parking or whatever it is at the start. So you can kind of design something from the beginning that is with equity in mind and with people in mind, where you can say, hey, these people are going to be able to join in and participate in an equal manner as everyone else. We've covered this a little bit. Good meetings have the following roles, and there's a link there from the ADA initiative, which has trained me in some of these pieces of work as well. So I guess as the last for the last 10 or 8 minutes that we've got left, I've dumped a whole bunch of information on you and kind of covered a few scenarios and different things. I would really love to hear what your experiences have been championing equality in JCI as an organisation or as leaders within your workplaces. You've shared a bit of different things that have gone wrong before and given some solutions as well, but I'd really love to hear, what you've tried, what you're struggling with, and if we could kind of, offer some solutions together for this last few minutes, or really any questions you have as well. Just while you're sharing or typing up stuff, here's a quick summary of what we've talked about. So we've talked about understanding and acceptance. So understanding yourself, understanding your own biases, and just being really forgiving of that. So being self-aware and being forgiving that you will make mistakes. We're all on a learning journey. And if you make a mistake, just correct yourself and move on. Reframing. So make sure that you reframe that, you try and reframe everything to include the context of, the context of oppression and marginalisation. Taking action if you make a mistake. Again, apologise, correct yourself, and move on, and be a champion for equality. Jen, I'm really glad to hear that. No, absolutely, I can totally relate to that. I think it is, someone who has, for me, someone who has really just put myself forward to be really inclusive and make this part of your work. I totally get that. And I'm so glad that it is empowering, because that is what I want it to be. And if you want to, discuss further and connect, please do let me know as well. If you have any other kind of stories to share about JCI, please do share. We've got 5 minutes left, and then I have to run off and get dressed for work. So I do have 5 minutes. Otherwise, my contact details are at the end as well. Just let me know. I know you've all shared quite a fair bit from your different cities and different contexts. So thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Kevin. And again, there's quite a lot of material to cover, and kind of, lots of theory, and that's stuff that I find really interesting in the statistics. But if you want to share something further with either your JCI team, or just want a little package of, here's some stuff that you could try, let me know, and I'm very happy to share that with you as well. If you've got my Instagram, Twitter, or LinkedIn, so if you want to leave me a comment or anything like that, feel free. I'm always very happy to talk about these topics, and I know that it can be exhausting, but yeah, definitely interesting. Thank you, Freya. And yeah, definitely. I think that's one of the things I've learned through JCI and some of the other work that I've done, is that what we're experiencing in our communities can be really global, so we can all kind of share learnings and actually, be championing this together. Thanks, Mohammed. That's great. Yeah, definitely. Let me know. Drop me a message. Thank you, Diane. And if you do use it, I'd really love to know how it goes, and kind of learning, because as I go and hear from other people who have used these, scenarios and different tools and tips, I have been updating the slides as well. So it does actually help with teaching others as well. Thank you. I believe we've got 3 minutes left. So if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, that's definitely, absolutely true, Kevin. Yeah. And I do want to say thank you so much for Suava and Reiki for organising this as well. It's been great and very smoothly organised and well put together series, so it's been a pleasure. And they've been able to work with me with the time zone differences as well, so that's been awesome. And thank you so much for all of you for listening to me for 1.5 hours with my morning voice. So thank you so much. Thanks, Jen. Awesome. Thanks, everyone. I am going to rush off to work now, so thank you so much. My contact details are all there, and I think the webinar has been recorded. So if you want to come back and have a look at any of the slides, all the sources for the slides are there, and research is there as well. So enjoy your evening for most of you, and if there's anyone in this time zone, enjoy your day as well. Thanks so much.